I'm Sunaina Anand, Director of Art Alive Gallery. And on behalf of Art Alive, we're delighted to welcome you all on this platform. We opened Patterns of Intensity on April 3rd as part of Delhi Art Week. The show brings together 11 contemporary emerging artists whose practices are strongly engaged with the challenges of habitation and its relationship to the perennial questions of belonging, settlement, and environment. We are here for a live session with Ranjit Hoskote, the curator of the exhibition, as he maps through the practices of 11 emerging contemporary artists and takes us through the show. I would like to welcome our artists, Anil Thambai, Barkha Gupta, Chandrashekar Koteshwar, Shyam, Latua, Kaushik Saha, Meghna Patpatia, Purvai Rai, Savia Mahajan, Suman Chandra, Teja Gavankar, and Vipul Badwa to this talk and look forward to an insightful session ahead. Ranjit, I welcome you to this platform and request you to take this conversation forward and give us a virtual walkthrough of the show, followed by a Q&A with the artist. Over to you, Ranjit.
Thanks so much, Sanena. And it's really lovely to see all of our participating artists here. Thanks to the prevailing situation, it's really the first time that we're all together in one space, and it's a digital space, but I suspect that's going to be the platform for common ground for at least a couple of years now. So we might as well get used to it. So it's been an unusual process of preparing for and curating the show. And I'll say a little more about that as we go along. But I do want to thank you, Sunena, and your marvelous team at Art Alive. And I want to thank all of the artists for having been so incredibly generous with time, energy, conversations, and forms of studio visit, ranging from the physical to the virtual. And that to me is usually the happiest part of these processes. Really engaging with very diverse imaginations that yet have very strong preoccupations in common. So what I'm going to do as we go along is to try and share my screen. Host disabled attendee screen sharing, it says. So Anushri will need to enable that. So I thought what we could do is to really go through the physical reality of the show, and I'll then annotate the practices, and then we'll talk together about what brings us together here, actually. It's still disabled, the screen sharing. Okay. While we wait for that, let me just say a little about the preoccupations that actually bring this show into a kind of coherence. You know, over the years, I've worked in different parts of the art ecology, with foundations, museums, biennials, with private galleries, festivals. And in each case, it's been a different kind of adventure, ranging from monographic exhibitions to retrospectives, to immersives, to transhistorical shows. With this exhibition, there was, for me, the delight of surprise of looking at emergent practices and looking at the ways in which 11 young practitioners, emerging practitioners, work with pretty much the same spectrum of urgencies, but respond in diverse ways through particular choices of medium, through, okay, the screen share is on. So I'm going to speak to and over the images, but I'll continue with this. Okay, here we are. And there's usually, all right, fabulous. Okay, so we know where we are and what we're doing with this title card. And we're now again in this moment where we see images, and yet we have presence. So I'm going to start moving into the gallery. What we did was to really produce 4 spaces, each with a certain flow of artistic practices, to create a kind of subliminal pattern. as one practice passes into another, there are dialogues that take place among the artists in each space. So what we're doing here is we're actually entering uh, art alive. And again, this is the very first time that I've ever curated anything remotely via WhatsApp video and Zoom and so on, because I'm just an obsessively hands-on curator. I need to be there moving things around and seeing how things work. It was extremely unsettling at one level for me to work like this long distance. And yet it opened up a whole new horizon of possibilities to just see uh, how one could generate meaning even at a distance, and to imagine that this is really how we're going to be working now as we go along. So we begin here with Chandrashekar Koteshwar, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about each practice as I go along. Chandrasekhar's work is something that seized my attention when I saw it, uh, because it draws on a play of scale. He refers to larger iconographies, inherited bodies of image making, and yet renders it all in this kind of intimacy of scale. The life of ritual, the life of social protocol, all of this gets reflected in his work. And uh, like some other artists whose work I've admired over the years, his training is in museology. So there's a very intriguing double consciousness at work, I think, in his art making. It's the production of the image, of the object, the sculptural object, alongside questions of how it's going to be shown, how it's going to appear across time. And somehow I tend to think that the imagination of the museologist has to be a transhistorical imagination. As you make an object, you're asking yourself, how might this look to a museum audience 100 years from now? What is its context? Does it carry its context? And in a work like this, for instance, uh, you know, it you're invited to consider what might be an archaeological dig. There's, as you know, archaeologists proceed in grids. They go down, something comes to light, the memory of previous epochs. And you're in this space between art making, display, discovery, and it's really an invitation to go through into different kinds of time. And that's a motif that's present in a number of the artists in this exhibition. How does time get sedimented? How does it get sedimented in the most material of objects? How do you work with terracotta? How do you work with firing techniques? How do you work with metal or ink or graphite? And yet convey to your viewers the sense not only of space and materiality, but also of deep time. And the title, which I've worked out at some point, refers to some of these experiences, patterns of intensity, because what we're trying to do here is to look at recurrent patterns that hold these 11 practices together. And this term intensity really leaped out at me from the pages of a work by an absolutely marvelous anthropologist called Bhrigupati Singh. It's in one sense poverty and the quest for life. It's in one sense a classic anthropological study of a community in a village context and how it deals with its questions. But one of the conceptual tools that he derives from being embedded in this community is that of intensities. And I want to quote Bhrigupati Singh's paragraph on this. He says, and I quote, "Intensity is an experiential term, a kind of thermodynamics of existence. It signals a range within the same threshold. Intensities express the ebb and flow of life, even when things seem to remain constant. A marriage, a job, an institution, a social or political movement may lose intensity and become lifeless, or regain it. These differences that depend on shifting intensities may be decisive for our welfare and happiness. In this sense, intensities make every day, every moment diurnal, Every instant we tend towards death or revival, waxing and waning ever so slightly. Such shifts of intensity are critical for ethnographic attentiveness. Someone sits beside us. Are they ebbing or are they ascendant? People are gathering. Will there be a riot or a festival? It is the difference of the animating intensities and how they ebb and flow and migrate. This is the quality of life. End of quote. So I've been thinking about this passage for quite a long time, and it seemed to me that in the work of the 11 artists here, this is what we're looking at: a waxing and a waning of energy, an ebb and flow of attention towards deep affect within and the urgencies outside. So when I look at work like Chandrashekhar's, for instance, it cannot be only iconography or museum practice. It is also set within a larger political sphere in which iconography, museums, beliefs are all laden with a political valency and have some kind of role or some kind of distortion that they go through in public life. I'm going to move or migrate now from questions of iconography and the museum to another set of questions that animate a number of the artists in Patterns of Intensity. In Ghanshyam Latua's work, for instance, here, we have a deep consciousness of how runaway processes of urbanization are threatening and endangering landscapes that pre-exist. And when I was talking to Ghanshyam and was thinking about his work, it occurred to me that, as we all know, the landscape is an invention. It's a human invention. Landscapes do not exist in nature. But the landscape, the horizon, the vanishing point, these are all functions of the fact that we are looking at the world. They don't pre-exist. But to the extent that we do experience landscapes, we can be either custodians of landscapes or we can be exploiters of landscapes. Now, unfortunately, the path to which humankind as a species has committed itself, and we as a nation state, that path is a path that believes that nature is merely a set of resources to be exploited. And thus, landscapes, with all their complexity, whether they're wetlands or this is the Koi landscape, which Ghanshyam is looking at. And what we've tended to do is to really evacuate, erase, and destroy all of these landscapes, which are ecologically vital. They sustain larger ecosystems. So I was thinking about practices that address these questions. For instance, this Koi landscape here that you see is not only is there a deep appeal to an ecologically sensitive context, not only does this come out of a position of eco-poetics, but what fascinated me also when I first saw Ghanshyam's work is the nature of the making of it, through pen, through ink, through the pricking with needles. And then we talked. I also said to him that it reminded me strongly of the works of artists I admire. There's Zarina Hashmi, for instance. There's a phase in her work when she uses the pinprick as a form of image making. I was thinking also of Fontana's Incisions, Somnath Hoare's Wound series, and many of these are also starting points for Ghanshyam, who was born in Midnapur, to whom the landscape of Bolpur around Shantiniketan, which you see here, is crucial. And also, with each of the 11 artists, I've been preoccupied with how they think, how they conduct their research. So for someone like Ghanshyam, Tagore's poem on the Khoi landscape is one of his starting points. So it's through science, it's through ecology, it's through poetry, it's through the art of a previous generation that you find the roots by which these artists come to the work they make. So very happily, it seems to me that among these emergent positions, a rupture with the foregoing way of doing things is important, but as is a rapture, a sense of enchantment with what has gone before and what one might draw on. A detail from this work, this body of work. And as I look at it, I suddenly think, my goodness, it reminds me of Dürer's patch of turf. the sense of detail. Again, the play between scale and detail is so important and vivid in the works of these artists. I'm thinking now here of looking at and thinking about Barkha Gupta's work. Also, please forgive me for talking about all of you in the third person. It's one of these situations where you're right here and I'm talking about you as if you weren't here and I'm talking to other people. But this is just a dramatic device, if you will. We'll all speak together after this. So what attracted me to Barkha's work when I first encountered it was the sense of liminality, the importance of the threshold in her work. Once again, the threshold is something that we will encounter, the space between, the intermediate space. We encounter this in many of the works on display in this exhibition. So this question of what it means to make a transition, what are the deficits or the advantages of moving, let us say, between built form and nature, between memory and hope, between architecture and ecology. These are questions that recur in much of Barkha's work. And in the work that she's developed for this exhibition, as I read it, it comes from a certain fascination, as the artist says, with placing structure and nature together. What is it that happens when you do that? What are the kinds of patterns that emerge? So in some of the work that we see here, there is a certain interplay between pattern as an abstraction and everything that we have by way of sensuous or haptic memory. Are we thinking about textile? Are we thinking about water? Are we thinking about reflections? There's all kinds of unspoken memories that resist language, which appear here. And yet there's also over against that the desire to produce a certain pattern, to work with abstraction. And in a work like this, I would situate it in the wider spectrum of the artist's work in terms of thinking about drawing as not a preparatory mode, but as an aim and an end in itself. How do we recover our sense of connection with other parts of the environment? Because so much of what we've done as creators of built form is to segregate ourselves, to isolate ourselves long before the quarantine in a sense of our species supremacy, and to increasingly exploit, oppress, and derogate, whether it's the animal kingdom or whether it's plant life. And a number of these questions come through. And something I was tracking through the exhibition also was, how is this to be achieved with everyday means, relatively more modest means, watercolor, pen and ink, graphite, printmaking? There's a strong part of my viewerly consciousness and my curatorial imagination that responds to this. I've always felt a strong sympathy for these ways of making, which are fundamental to how art gets made, but they too often get seen as sort of prior forms along the way to more ambitious compositional machines. And I like to think that we don't have to make that kind of distinction. It's really vital to see each medium and each genre for its own accomplishments. Which leads me really quite directly now to the work of Anil Thambai. And again, it's the way in which, with many of our artists here, it's the things that they inherit from their context, from their family, from the way they've grown up, that find articulation and translation in their work. Barkha's parents, for instance, are architects, and she's grown up with that context. Anil comes from a family of masons, people who've been involved with the construction, the process of construction. And when we spoke, he told me about how this repetitive pattern of bricklaying in courses was really the basis for a certain kind of language for him. But having mastered that notion of repetition, what happens in his works is something else altogether. It's more a recursion. It's the ways in which architectural forms, whether they're spandrels, flying buttresses, the interior of a dome, or as you see here, what is it really? Are we looking up into a dome? Are we looking down into a kund? We're invited really to reassess our whole sense of how we make sense of space. There's a powerful uh, haptic relationship to graphite, to the medium, and to a sense of how we navigate space. To me, it's incredibly, this image is somewhere between an impression and a simulation. It's really an invitation to enter a space that has more dimensions that are immediately on offer. Also, when we spoke, Anil talked about this Brecht poem that had been very important for him, about how no one remembers the people who made the pyramids or the cathedrals. We are in awe of these great monuments that are produced as evidence of architectural heritage, but we don't always remember the labor that's gone into it. So this afterlife of labor, this fact that we need to privilege the activities that create these monuments, that's very strongly present in this work. So there's always in all of the works that we have here in this exhibition, there's an interplay between the sublime and the disquieting, beauty and labor. So that also forms a certain thread through the exhibition. And of course, the sheer materiality. I have to say that one of the great delights for me working on this exhibition was the diversity of the material, how artists actually chose to work with these different media to test them out, the stimuli and the challenges involved. And I'm going to cross now to Meghna Patpatia's work, where again, one of the key concerns in this polyptych that we see is with forms of home on the one hand and of mobility on the other. So there's, remember that the notion of habitation and settlement was a starting point for this exhibition. So with Meghna's work, when I first saw it again, I was struck by how, on the one hand, there's the form of the mollusk, for instance. There are all kinds of natural forms where creatures make or seek home. And over against that, you see the way in which the human presence is recorded, whether through diving bells or through the observatory. There's what gets dramatized in her work, in Meghna's work, is an environment that has tenets of different ability, if you will. There are all of the natural species that are attempting to get on with their own instinctive processes. And then there's the human intervention. And what is the, what's the symbiosis? What's the conflict that goes on? All this gets played out in her work. And the form of the polyptych allows her to really present these different alternatives. In a sense, it's you have a spectrum of possibilities. So there isn't any single teleological form of being that's privileged. What you see instead is a set of interlocking life cycles. And sometimes they come together in dramatic ways where you have, what is it? A slug, a shell, a device that's nautical as well as aerial. So there are these fantasy forms that yet encode deep traumas about displacement, diaspora, and the making of habitation. I'm going to take those thoughts with me now to Teja Gavankar's work. Once again, speaking of how the past projects into the future, but can be translated in different ways. Teja, when we spoke, talked about how in her particular interest in metals and in their intensity and materiality, she was drawing on her own particular family background, which happens to be a family of hereditary goldsmiths. So what does it mean to be aware of the valency of metals, of how they interact with each other? What is the action of the elements on metal? So whether it's brass, as you see here, or cotton, steel, or brick, there's again this this fascination with creating, if you will, fragments of built form, bringing them into an interior, and then asking us as viewers to respond to these objects in themselves, and also in terms of what they have to say to us about larger processes over which we have little control. So again, it's what fascinates me here is this play of scale, something that might be an intimate object, which might even carry the residues of memory, and yet it speaks of much larger metropolitan developments over which there's very little control. And I'm going to carry those thoughts with me. Remember, what we're looking at here again is somehow the presence of metal, of something that needed ore to produce it. And those thoughts carry me through to Suman Chandra and to Savia Mahajan, who I'm going to be talking about now. Suman's work, which you see here, for instance, and Savia's is here. I'll speak first about Suman's work. It's preoccupied with the way in which our environment is being transformed by processes of mining. Even as we seek the minerals that sustain our fairly unsustainable lifestyles now, what is it that we're doing to the forests? What is it that we're doing to different parts of the ecosystem? What is it that we're doing with the communities that have lived in an organic relationship to these landscapes? So there's here, as in the work of many of the other artists that I've talked about and will talk about, there's both an element of research and there's an element of I would actually venture to say activism that is involved here. Again, with an image like this, for instance, I'm struck by how it's made with a medium that also comes out of the deep earth, has been worked on through the same processes that give us these lifestyle sustaining minerals, and yet the life of labor is disregarded. So an image like this, I would look at it and I would think about how we're also being asked to acknowledge all of this invisible activity that allows us to continue with our lives. What is it that we're not looking at a certain subaltern level? What are these underregarded, unregarded lives and processes that we need to be far more attentive to? What does it mean for these images to confront us and to demand from us a sense of equity and justice? And in this work, I have to say that this work here at the lower left hand is a light box, which you will see here. I have to point. This is a work in which is like a lexicon of a number of these questions, which reminds us of the invisible processes of extraction, exploitation, refinement, and oppression, frankly, that are caught up along with these questions of labor, equity, and justice, and are caught up with ultimately consumption and existence. So in some ways, this work to me kind of ripples out and is in dialogue with everything else in this exhibition. So when we walk around this exhibition, whether physically or virtually, there's also an incredible, for me, polyphony of artistic voices that are in some way responding to one another, even though there's been no prior discussion. And I'm going to carry those thoughts of mining and minerals with me to the work of Savia Mahajan. These works that you see here speak of, at least to me, of deep geological time, the largest possible time scale in which all of our finite and fragile lives are lived out. And I like also the way in which these objects are both found and made. I mean, they actually are made objects, but they seem to have been found. They suggest metamorphic, igneous processes by which rocks are made. But they also remind us of the kind of metallurgic research into processes that goes into this kind of artistic choice. Looking at these works, I've also several times been reminded that they look like burnt books. So there's a kind of spectrum that they cross. On the one hand, they remind us of deep geological time and the creative impetus of the planet. But in the form they take, they also remind us of how the works of culture can be endangered, they can be threatened, they can be destroyed by forces that are opposed to culture. So they kind of span this spectrum of meanings for me. I'm going to show here some of Savia's other works as well. And again, you see from the kinds, and I'm going to draw each artist out also on these questions of research and practice, thinking through the various kinds of materials that come from different domains and how they come together into the production of this hybrid object. So I would have a question for Savia later about the future of sculpture in a way. I'm going to come now to the last space in the exhibition, where we see works by Vipul Badva, Kaushik Saha, and Purvai Rai. With Vipul's work, when I first saw images of it, and it's set in a space partly real and partly imaginary called Mayapuri. And I thought to myself, yes, this is the ephemeral, the makeshift architecture that's come to characterize so much of our sense of the metropolitan. And the blue in this work, for instance, I thought to myself, if you approach the city where I live, for instance, from the air, Bombay, you'd think that the whole city was made of blue top or corrugated tin roofs that have been painted blue. It's so blue when you fly in daytime. And I thought to myself, my goodness, that's really the color of the temporary. It's the color of the metropolitan. It's the color of the peri-urban. And yet people craft and fashion lives for themselves out of this unpromising scenario. So Vipul's work, as it enters into our space here, also talks about migration. It talks about patterns of life where people migrate. As we know, one of the great traumas, one of the great collective traumas of these years, last year and this, has been the forced migration of people between the city and the village. The way in which last year, whatever we call the system or the establishment, simply betrayed and let down millions of people who had helped keep our cities going. They were just left to their own devices to walk home thousands of miles, to die on the way. I mean, no one really thought of a system of healing and of consideration or of acknowledgement for these lives and the labor they had provided. And I thought to myself, when I look at works like this, I'm also reminded of these lives, these circulations, and of people who live always in a certain schizoid manner. Their lives invested partly in the metropolis where the work is, and partly wherever they come from. And where do they really come from in the end is the question. So again, this is a study in the kind of betweenness that we've seen in the work of many of the other artists in the exhibition. I'm going to pass on with those thoughts to Purvai Rai's work. What you see here is, I'm going to focus on one. It's work that emerges from a broader spectrum of concerns with what solidarity means. What does it mean to live in a plural society that's being increasingly polarized? And this has been articulated in the artist's work in different ways, through choices of material, in some cases, material found on the site of social conflict. In this case, working with a material like jute, which comes with its, we also saw earlier work on hemp, for instance. Jute carries with it, again, resonances of packaging, of manufacture, of labor. And to me, it's also about how materials have their invisible histories. And as viewers, we need to be ethically aware of this. It's not just the surface or the product or the object, it's also what's gone into it. And when I look at a work like this, these are some of the questions that I think about as well. And here again, there's on the one hand, a certain, if you will, movement towards the sublime, towards the natural world. And yet these are other questions that come into consideration. These are questions we're being asked to look at. And again, I'm zeroing in to look at how these questions are embedded in the very granularity of the works that we're looking at here. I'd also like to think about the mental world, the world of imagination that each of our artists are bringing to the game, whether it's vanishing landscapes that are being ruined, or whether it's questions of mining, whether it's questions of built form that's falling apart, or questions of societies that are falling apart. With all of our 11 artists, there's a tremendous sense of living in a time of transition, of infrastructures that are coming apart, certainties that are collapsing, and yet one must bear witness to this, one must speak of this, one must make art out of this. So I think there's both I wouldn't call it a pessimism. I think there is a certain sense of despair, but it's held in place and counteracted by a sense of resurgent hope as well. Speaking again to this trope of intensities, how these artistic energies ebb and flow between despair and hope. I think that's been something that's inspired me in the months I've spent working on this exhibition. And as we conclude, I'm going to come to Kaushik Saha's work, where you see that, as he puts it in his title, how might one hold a land within a frame? How might one bear witness to large processes of dismantling, recycling, collapse, resurrection, and how might one bear witness to that within the frame? So there's an argument here also for thinking about how painting can yet be read. Painting is an incredibly resistant animal. It's, at various points, like the novel, like the biennial, the death of painting has been announced, and yet here's painting, it continues. But also by expanding its ambit, both materially and conceptually. And what you see here, for instance, is oopsie. When I look at Kaushik's work, I'm also thinking, as I did when I first saw it, I thought to myself, there's somewhere in the manthan of this painterly process and this churning, you have a practice that draws on what's available to the sculptor, what's available to the artisan, what's available to the street side jugaad craftsperson. So whether it's, these thrown away sheets, whether it's nails, whether it's, bicycle tires. In a way, this is a portrait of a society that is constantly recycling its realities and its myths to live by. And this is why I thought the exhibition, if you follow a certain itinerary, will take you here. And this is where I thought we'd also bring this talk round to a conclusion. So I wanted to really think about how in Kaushik's work, all of these different interlocking cycles of activity, aesthetic, artisanal, economic, all come together into a certain sense of totality. And once again, this work speaks, as I said, to, it sets up a certain conversation with the works around it and the works in the rest of the space, of which we now have a general sort of view. And as these lockdowns continue, it's on a website that you're going to be able to see all of the work, all of the transitions that I've tried to evoke for you with the means available to us. You also see how particular dialogues have been set up across the space. And here endeth part one of what we're doing today. How are we doing on time, Sunana? You're on mute.
Yeah, so we have about 25 minutes.
Okay, fabulous. So what I might do now is maybe cease to screen share, and we're back on here. And really, if we could do something like a rapid fire round, I'm going to ask each of the artists one exact question. And then we turn around and ask everyone who's been so kind as to attend today, we could seek out questions if there are questions. Yeah. So if I could just go in order, I'm gonna ask Chandrashekar my first question. Chandrashekar, could you talk a little about how your training in museology has influenced your image making practice? Are you aware always of history through the medium of the museum as a kind of phantom presence, or does it enable and emancipate you? Please don't say it doesn't mean anything to you at all.
Hello everyone. Actually, um, uh, having worked with many sculptural mediums, I have decided to further my language in this medium of terracotta. Uh, After my museological museology give me the chances to explore more ideas and even technically. And later, my references though comes from history, traditional, and cultural artifacts, and I create my own version without minding about the rules and canons of the tradition. Uh, so that addition become theme of my works. And so
Yeah.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Chandrasekhar, for evoking for us this conceptual traffic, if you will, between canons and rules and traditions and how they inform your work. I'm going to ask Ghanshyam to come in now on this. And Ghanshyam, could you tell us a little bit about how your biographical connection with the Khoi landscape became so important to you as something that's worthy of being a subject that you want to devote so much energy to, and essentially, how did you fix on it as a subject? How did it become? I mean, how did it leap out of so many possible subjects and become something that's so important to you in your current phase of work? I mean, I remember how you told me about this, how this Tagore poem about the Khoi landscape has remained with you over these years. So could I ask you to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Hello everyone. Basically, Khoi landscape जो है वेस्ट बंगाल का एक प्राण रीजन है. बीरभूम डिस्ट्रिक्ट में शांति निकेतन के पास सिचुएटेड है. तो ये एक लैटेराइट लैंडफॉर्म है और इसका इरोडेड एरिड एंड स्पार्सली जो एनवायरनमेंट है, ये शांति निकेतन का जो आर्टिस्ट है इसको हमेशा ही अट्रैक्ट किया है. और उन लोगों ने बहुत सारा पेंटिंग, ड्राइंग्स इनसे इंस्पायर होकर बनाया है. और मैं अभी के सिचुएशन में जो देख रहा हूँ, ये खोई लैंडस्केप मतलब mindlessly is being excoriated by us through an agonizing mechanical process by using giant industrial tools like JCB, Hydra, etc. So as I am come from a farmer family, this actually the painful process or drastic transformation natural to urban landscape affects me a lot. So through my work, I am trying to achieve feelings and perception. And जैसे कि यहाँ का जो कोई लैंडस्केप है उसका जो कलर है वो रेडिश ब्राउन है. तो मेरे काम पे भी मैं एक ब्राउन कलर का मोनोक्रोम यूज करके लैंडस्केप पे इमेज बनाया और उसके ऊपर मैं 7 निबिल देके उसको डिगिंग किया रियलिटी का पेनफुल प्रोसेस को मिमिक करने के लिए. बेसिकली द पेंटेड पेपर और tinted paper, the skin of the tinted paper or painted paper is a land to me, and the method of pricking or skinning the paper surface is the human intervention on natural landscape. That's.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ghanshyam. Barkha, I'm coming to you next. I wanted to carry forward these thoughts of the with a certain choice of chromatics, a certain sense of in-betweenness. Could you talk a little bit about the works that finally went into the show? Because when we began, we were thinking more about your preoccupation with architecture and nature. But I was actually intrigued to see how eventually questions of pattern became quite dominant for you in the work that you eventually brought into the show.
So basically, like my work explores the idea of nature and structure together, and I was always looking at the idea of home and space. And I think as soon as like the lockdown hit and just being confined to a physical space hit, it became more about a desire of exploring home as earth, as nature, and seeing the representation of earth in architecture and how they draw these sections and we think that that's the representation of earth, and that's why it started coming out. And I started seeing these shapes of like seed pods and things that you see in nature that surrounds us, and that started speaking to me about fertility. And like, so the whole idea started becoming more about seeing earth as a space rather than just seeing the four walls that you live in as a space, which I was largely exploring. Like in the past work that you'd seen, it was always about structure being limited to the architectural sphere. And then I think we also had a conversation about the whole destruction of it.
Yes.
And as soon as like the lockdown hit, it just expanded for me to explore element of earth like that. And that's where the whole monochromatic uh, color comes from, like the whole color of earth and the shape and the form. And I saw
Right.
it as a repetition, actually. I started seeing it. And it is also a shape that I've seen growing up, right? Like I've seen, uh, and just like exploring that shape and like immersing myself in it and how it would come, it was way more intuitive than I imagined it to be.
Super. Thank you. Thanks, Barkha. Going to carry those thoughts about repetition or recursion and pattern to Anil now, who I do. Oh, there you are at the top of my screen anyway. So Anil, quick question would be, you've evolved this language which has to do with built form, with architecture, with often something that is seen from inside of an edifice. What was your feeling working on that language at a time when there was such a sense of quarantine, claustrophobia, immobility? Have these current experiences inflected your work in any way, or is that something you're thinking about?
Yeah, can you hear?
Yes.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, actually, you can say that, that also influenced me, especially quarantine in a way of interpretations, we can say that. But especially when you look at my early works, my works were completely figurative traditions. Since 2015, my works has been changed into architecture because I was looking at what actually my ancestors their contribution, what was in the history. So slowly I started in the architecture and bricks patterns. This all slowly started as a language. So I took 4 or 5 years to build up this language. So for me, the interior also very important because I invite you to directly interior. So there is no any properties of nothing is there. Only you can see the wall and the spaces. So I'm talking about the very direct interpretations of past labor. This all, yeah.
Fabulous. Thanks, Anil. The concept of the interior is this display of what belongs within, what is outside, what is transitional is also been that intermediate strong here. So Meghna, I'm going to come to you. Where are you, Meghna? Oh, there you are. Yes.
Yeah.
you know, I spoke about your image making when I spoke about your work, but what I left unannotated, because I was hoping we come to it here, is all the articles that you've written
I don't.
Yeah.
I'm
okay.
sorry, I didn't get that.
Yeah.
The whole screen kind of hung. Yeah.
Okay.
Can
Are
you
we
repeat
back?
the question?
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, when I talked about your work just now in the talk, I
Yeah.
focused on your image making, but I didn't talk about your surface because I wanted us to talk about it now. The way you
Okay.
build it up, which comes from your training in conservation.
Right.
So, so
I
could I draw
told.
you out on that a little bit? That the fact that
Sure, sure.
you, yeah, because that's so integral to the work. So,
Definitely. So I work with a very translucent linen, and it's kind of a textile with very open weaves. So you paste, papers on it to kind of create a terrain, which is what really intrigued me while I would, line manuscripts when I worked, in the museum and in the field of restoration. So that kind of gave rise to how, a glue forms a pattern onto the, papers that you paste, and it creates like a terrain for, that almost makes a base for me to follow with ink. So that's a little bit about how it forms, and I kind of follow that, and it gives me like a very intuitive uh, outline of sorts to follow, because it's almost like a geographical demarcation of a map like forms. So yeah, that's how it forms, and then the forms start coming up, and everything follows soon after.
thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for that.
Thank you.
Is there like a reverb or am I hearing it?
I think only when Meghna was speaking, it happened.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
Oh no.
Yeah. Okay. But don't
Okay.
worry.
I hope y'all could hear me.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Staying on that track of how the material can, you know, as the Gutai artists used to say, you have to listen to the cry of the material. Teja, I'm coming to you now. You know, we did talk about how your particular family heritage has brought you to a very fine appreciation of metallurgy. But when one thinks of the goldsmith's art, one thinks of delicacy, intimacy, and so on. But I noticed that some of your metallurgical choices are rough and robust. You know, for instance, you work with cotton steel, kind of a pre-rusted steel. So could you tell us a little bit about your in some sense deeply emotional response to the metal surface, and why what guides these choices?
Mhm. So yeah, I mean, metal comes quite. It's very new in my practice. It's been, I guess, 2 years now. I'm going towards this, and basically, works are always around. It's a respond to what I'm surrounded with, and in these case, like as everybody is like how we are responding to spaces around you, and we are all home quarantine, and I was looking at this, the architecture is the most uh, what I keep looking at that space. So I took these elements like these steps and windows and things like that, all interior material. But I was thinking like earlier I used to work with brick, tiny brick. Then I thought like how I can bring these elements, architectural element into a sculpture side. So I was thinking of steel and many other material. I like the cotton steel's materiality, where how the cotton steel create, like the quality of material is something, it creates a rust on the surface, and it that layer of the rust become, a protection for the further rusting. So that's idea at that point of time when the lockdown time and everything, where we were waiting for the uh, vaccination. That's, I guess, I started connecting, where you're taking something inside and you're creating a barrier kind of to get protected. So yeah, I mean, that's how I guess cotton steel comes in the picture, where I like this idea. I started connecting to this time particularly. And and yes, I mean, all these the brass sculptures and everything, I keep looking at metal as a there's a drawing quality. So I work with silver as well, where where silver is more like a pencil line, I think of. And where right now those brass cast was more of uh, towards the all those lockdown, that saaf safai and the cleaning your home. I found my dad's dies, where he used to work as a die maker too. So I thought of those solid pieces, that have a certain weight, though they are very tiny. So I like this idea of like how the tiniest object can be, have a lot of weight, and the form is very, very strong. So and that's how I go down to that smaller scale first time in the practice. Yeah, I mean, I hope I answered for the.
Absolutely. I mean, my questions are prompts. They're meant to really form like an entry point into your imaginations, all of you. So in that, thank you, Teja. I'm going to move to Suman and those thoughts. Where is, here he is. Yes. Suman, the question I had for you was, having traveled with you through your work, it just occurred to me that you're trying out different scales, you're trying out different forms of engagement with the viewer. Are you at all thinking of working with video or with film? Because in a way, we see different kinds of media that you bring into it. It's just a question that came to me yesterday when I was looking at your entire portfolio.
Yeah, maybe in future I will do a small documentary or something like of that, because I have a lot of documented footage there, a lot of photographs there that I didn't use any past exhibition or any display. So now I am planning a good archive for those all of things to display in a one exhibition, to uh, to take my viewers to all through my journey. So maybe film would be good in future scale. So I didn't try any video clip with that. Now I am trying installations and sculpture most probably. So trying the material quality of the coal, the blackness of the coal. So that's why now I am doing most probably sculptures and small drawings. So maybe you suggested it's good. Film may be good.
Super. Thank you, Suman.
Thank you, sir.
Savia, I'm coming to you now. Well, it's a question that draws on two facts about your practice. One is that ceramics is a subculture that has had to often defend itself, has to make its own way. Now there's actually ceramics triennial, so there's a much greater degree of cogency and visibility, if you will. But that's not always been the case. So, is there a community of fellow practitioners that you feel sustains your practice, or has it been a more isolated kind of journey? I ask also because there's a high degree of scientific, technical detail that goes into the kind of work you do. So who would be your points of reference? Who would you compare notes with? That's really it's a question about your practice.
Thank you, Ranjit. So I think there's a backstory, of course, to this whole thing, because I started off as a painter, and I wanted to move away from a flat surface of expression to working with my hands. And I guess that led me to exploring whole lot of different materials at that point. And of course, it was very tough to find this really perfect setup in Bombay related to ceramic. People were working in different small pockets, studio potters, sculptors, but I somehow managed to kind of find this one potter who welcomed me into his shed in Goregaon, and his name is Sandeep Manchekar, and he was a kiln maker, he was a production potter, and the time when I decided to go to him, I told him that I just want to explore the material, because I'm really coming from a space of wanting to unlearn what I've learned, and I really want to work with my hands. So I just want to have this. Basically, I just want to deep dive into this material, and so he opened up the studio, and I think it was because I didn't come from this space of training. I was looking in very different, very deep experimental directions, and 4 years of intensive experimentation, but also 4 years of intensive failures, because I was really mixing a lot of materials, combusting a lot of things in not my own kiln, but somebody else's, borrowed, what you say, a kiln and studios. So that was my journey, and definitely, like you rightly pointed out, to practice ceramic, it is very important to be part of some community, at least as a starting point. And I mean, I was fortunate enough to have those doors open to me, and that's how it kind of it led me to finally coming to a point where I was very interested in embedding natural material in clay, and clay just kind of became like a carrier of those materials for me. And I have this term for it, which is I call them ghost materials, because while I'm working with those soft organic natural materials, whether they are man-made or found in nature, um, I've reached this space where I've figured a way to embed them in clay, petrify them, and I would say that's been the outcome of very deep experimentation, and yeah, like really diving into deep end of failure, for that matter. So a lot of my works also come out of the failed experimentation. So as ceramists also try and understand glazing, try and understand compositions, I too learned, but on field, like those 3 or 4 years, because it was an atmosphere, a setup of a very technical uh, so I was surrounded by a lot of technical people as well. So it was all about what I could absorb as an artist and what I could just leave, and that's how I just continued with it, and I continued with the whole chemistry, and something about it worked, because I don't remember loving chemistry when I studied in my school years, but there's something about it that the language of it, or what you say, I think the genius Loki of the material just opened up to me in a way. I mean, it sounds very philosophical, but it's really true that it really kind of opened itself up to me. And so as of today, I mean, yes, I owe the start to this very small community, and these small studios and sheds in Mumbai, because it's tough to practice on your own. But as of today, I practice solo, and I have my own studio, basically my own kiln, and that's where I experiment now. So yeah.
Thanks so much, Savia. That was really, but it's true. I mean, it's not a metaphysical thing. It's actually very physical, how material addresses you. So Vipul, I'm going to come to you now with this thought about materials, but also where is the studio? Where's the space of the studio? Because one might have a classical, traditional studio, but sometimes, who knows, your laptop might be your studio, or the street. So in your case, I'd really be interested to ask you about the forms of research that go into your conjuring up of Mayapuri, what forms of observation, looking at different kinds of settlements, whether they're squats or shanties or slums, could you take us through this journey? How do you find your material that goes into these
हाँ
paintings?
मैं पहली बार जब दिल्ली में मैं गया हूँ बहुत बार स्लम एरिया में फोटोग्राफी करने के लिए, साथ में एक छोटा सा कैमरा भी होता है, तो मैं देखता हूँ वहाँ पे, मैं एक फार्म फैमिली से बिलोंग करता हूँ, तो क्या हमारे घर बहुत बड़े होते हैं, तो वहाँ पर बहुत ज़्यादा जो चीज़ें होती है वो व्यवस्थित होती है, मतलब कुछ अच्छे स्पेस होता है बहुत ज़्यादा, तो वहाँ स्लम एरिया में ऐसी स्पेस नहीं होती, तो मुझे वहाँ पर चीज़ें पड़ी हुई दिखती है, कुछ बड़े बैरल होते हैं, पानी की जो कमी होती है, तो वो सब मैं देखता हूँ, कपड़े देखता हूँ, तो वहाँ से मैं कुछ ऐसे जो मुझे नया लगता है मेरे लिए, जो वो छोटे घर है, बेसिकली वो स्लम एरिया में बहुत छोटे घर होते हैं और हमारे घर बहुत बड़े होते हैं, तो मुझे वो बहुत नया लगा, तो मैं कैमरा रखता हूँ या तो फिर मोबाइल में भी फोटो पिक कर लेता हूँ, बाद में आकर मैं लैपटॉप में से कुछ अनवांटेड चीज़ जो होती है वो निकाल देता हूँ, जो मुझे नहीं चाहिए मेरा विजुअल एक्सपीरियंस के हिसाब से, फिर पेपर में मैं आराम से वो करता हूँ, छोटी चीज़ को मैं छोटा ही रखता हूँ, मैं बड़ा नहीं करता, क्योंकि मेरे लिए मेरे घर बहुत ज़्यादा बड़े हैं जो स्लम एरिया के घर से, तो मैं छोटा ही उसे प्रेजेंट करता हूँ। हाँ,
Interesting.
Vipul, Shukriya. Let me take these thoughts, Purva, to you, because this question of transiting among scales, of coming from a particular place of, let us say, privilege, and then addressing the vulnerabilities of others, that's been part of your practice and also the context that you've grown up in. So could I draw you out a little on how all of this really operates in terms of the artistic choices you make? Because I know from our conversation and from looking at your work that sometimes your investments in social activism, for instance, will take the form of something that's much more, if you will, diagrammatic, architectural, tending towards a statement. But equally, in the work that you have in the show, there's a certain movement towards abstraction. You don't close the door on abstraction. So with you, as with many practitioners in your generation, I find it liberating that artists don't have to take up an either or. It's not figurative versus abstraction or something versus something else, which was really a malady in previous generations. So could I ask you to talk a little bit about how a certain situation or material will dictate your artistic choice, or how you make those choices?
Yeah. So firstly, hi everyone. It's so nice to connect finally. Coming to your question. So I mean, like in all honesty, my practice runs all over because I think a lot of my work is born out of what is happening today. So current affairs plays a huge role because I get overwhelmed, I get anxiety, I get all of the bad feelings when I read a piece of news. And I think for me to kind of be able to get over it, not in the sense of ignoring it, but to be able to respond to it, art really goes a long way. Growing up in a family where my father's a photographer, he's documented last 50 years of Indian history. My mother, conservation architect, who's she's working with historical sites, and she doesn't see buildings as isolated structures but sees them in a larger context. So who it was made for, what it's used now, what's the purpose, and what does the future of this particular space looks like. And I think these are the questions that kind of jump into my practice as well. um, so I mean, like my work is very abstract. Like when I talk and when you see my work, I don't know to how many it makes sense or to how many is it actually, how if they interact with it the way I kind of try to create it. But for me, I feel every mark you make metaphorically adds to the bigger story. And that's exactly what my work does. Like each white dot in this particular series is a part of a whole. And I think that's a big idea that I kind of work with as well. So my other series as well looks at whether it's a dialogue between two opposing communities or religious groups or whatever it may be. We don't hope for a world where everyone gets along, but you hope for a world where difference of opinion goes into dialogue and not, I'm also trying to be politically correct, but not in terms of harming each other. So what does a tolerant world looks like? And like you put it very well, that my work is actually looking at the idea of solidarity. What does that mean? Even though we're so different, why can't we just get along? I mean, we're here, all of us are here, and we all coexist. So I think that becomes important aspect of what I try to kind of like, I want the viewer to experience, like, let's just get along, you know? So that's, I think, my practice in a gist.
Thanks so much, Purve. And I'm going to come now to Kaushik, who's, I mean, the three of you, Vipul, you and Kaushik, share this space. And I was thinking that there's this social portraiture of one kind or another that comes through in all three works. Kaushik, could I ask you about this, also when we spoke, we talked about this idea of how you create a portrait of a society through its residues, through what it throws away, through what it recycles. Where was the beginning for you? I mean, how did you make these relatively unorthodox choices? And then you've remained committed to them, and you've built these incredible surfaces, which we also saw in close-up to see what they really look and feel like. Really wading out into a space somewhere between painting and sculpture and joinery, if you will. So could I ask you to lead us through the beginnings? What led to this form, these choices?
थैंक यू सर। और मेरा जो काम है तो मैं नॉर्मली पेंटर हूँ, और काफ़ी टाइम से मेरा जो सीरीज कैनवस वर्क में जो मेरा एक्रिलिक ऑन कैनवस में मैंने काम किया, देन उसके बाद कुछ टाइम के बाद मेरा काम थोड़ा शिफ्ट होता है कि थोड़ा न्यू सीरीज़ में काम करने का इच्छा होता है। तो ये मटेरियल बेस्ड काम देन उसके बाद मैंने स्टार्ट किया, और मटेरियल के थ्रू मेरे सोसाइटी का बहुत कुछ मैं दिखा सकता हूँ जो मैं पेंट करके भी नहीं दिखा सकता, वो मुझे लगता है। क्योंकि एक मटेरियल कुछ बोलते हैं कि लाइक जब मैं मेरे काम में, जैसे आपने देखा है कि साइकिल का ट्यूब मैंने यूज़ किया है, तो कुछ ट्यूब में मैं जैसे देखता हूँ कि 1 या 2 पंक्चर है, और कुछ ट्यूब में मैं फाउंड जो ट्यूब मुझे मिलते हैं, तो कुछ ट्यूब में मैं देखते 5 या 6 पंक्चर है। तो वो 2 ट्यूब में से मुझे सोसाइटी के एकदम नीचे के जो एक इकोनॉमिकली पोर इंसान है, उन दोनों इंसान को मैं दिखा सकता हूँ। लाइक किसी का इनकम 3000 रुपीज़ है, जिसने सोचा है कि चलो पंक्चर हो गया है, नेक्स्ट महीने करा लेते हैं, तो वैसे नेक्स्ट महीने करते करते उन्होंने चेंज नहीं किया, तो उसको 5 या 6 पंक्चर हो गया, तो वो फेंक दिया फिर। और किसी में देखा मैंने 2 पंक्चर है या फिर 1 पंक्चर है, तो वो पंक्चर के जो निशान है उसके थ्रू मुझे पता चलता है कि ये आदमी का शायद इकोनॉमिकल स्टैंडर्ड थोड़ा ऊपर होगा, शायद 9 या 10,000 रुपीज़। तो ये जो 2 इंसान, इस दोनों का पोर्ट्रेट में कभी भी मैं पेंट करके नहीं दिखा सकता था। तो मुझे मेरे काम में ये 2 जो हमारी सोसाइटी का एक बहुत बड़े एक हिस्सा है, ये जो इकोनॉमिकल स्टैंडर्ड में रहते हैं, या फिर मैं खुद भी शायद इसी फैमिली से आया हूँ, तो इनको मैं मेरे मटेरियल के थ्रू मैं ऐसे दिखाया। और भी मेरे जो काम पे जो मटेरियल यूज़ होता है, वो सब इंडस्ट्रियल मटेरियल्स होता है नॉर्मली, और चीप मटेरियल्स होता है। तो ये सब मटेरियल्स को मैंने मेरे काम में जैसे इनकॉर्पोरेट किया मेरे विजुअल एक जो जर्नी है उसके थ्रू। तो वैसे मेरे काम मेरे सोसाइटी के बारे में बात करता है, बट नॉर्मली मेरे काम में लैंडस्केप और एडवर्टाइजमेंट वो मेरे काम का बैकबोन है।
Thank you so much, Kaushik. Shukriya. This was, yeah, I really have to say, I thoroughly enjoyed myself listening to all of these accounts and responses. Sunana, we now
like, I mean, this has been such an amazing session, and it's so nice to hear about them, how sensitive they all are, and to know about their practice, the way, what goes behind what we see. Because an audience comes to the gallery and they just see the work and they say, oh, it's nice, it's not nice. And sometimes they want to know more about the artist, and most of them don't want to know much about, they just respond to the work, what they see. But it's so nice to do this session, and I'm so happy that each one of you are here. And thank you, Ranjit, so much. There are so many comments and responses that I can see that have come, and appreciating you specifically, Ranjit, for putting this show and putting this whole team together. I would call them a team that's been working on for this show for so many months now, and each one of you, because I can read out a few of the comments, like Parul Dave Mukherjee. She says, thanks, Ranjit, for a very evocative reading of these extraordinary works. Congratulations to the team Art Alive. Then we have Katie Ravindran saying, superb work, Barkha, specifically for you. But he also says, after a long time, a daringly curated collection of refreshing new work, new futures. So thank you, all of you. You are definitely the future, and which looks pretty hopeful because you all are very sensitive. What I could make out, you can articulate through your work in a very positive way, because it's nice to show that we are actually documenting the times we are living in. And I can see somewhere everybody, and through your works, we can see are affected by what has been happening over a year of lockdown and sitting at home. And I'm sure the body of work that's being created at this point of time will go down in the history for sure. I feel, because we're going to be talking about this many times in the future. I get that feeling. So thank you so much. Then I have somebody saying, Anirban Kamru saying, great experience. It is for me. Best wishes to all of you. Then we have Cheryl. Cheryl showed with us in the migration show that we did last year, that Tara Sabrawal curated. She's writing from New York. And this was a wonderful presentation. Wonderful to meet the artist responding to insightful questions. Thank you, Cheryl. So there she goes. And so there are many, many more. I think probably ask Anushri to send them, and
that would be lovely.
Yeah, and we've had Anushri just sent me the numbers. We had more than 300 people on Facebook.
Oh my, okay.
Who were live there right now, and beside we had about 75 on Zoom, and this is going to be shown recording on our on YouTube as well, and then one could keep on looking at it and record it. And we've also recorded it for our archives, because the way Ranjit has talked about each artist and their work practice and how each one of you responded to it, this needs to be preserved. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody.
Thank you all the attendees.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
All the best.
And take care of yourself. Looking forward to seeing all of you in person very soon at Art Alive.